Welcome to the 5 Books for Catholics podcast, where experts explain their pick of 5 outstanding books on an aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. In the Constitution on Sacred Liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium, the Second Vatican Council says the following: very rightly, the fine arts are considered to rank among the noblest activities of man's genius. And this applies especially to religious art and to its highest achievement, which is sacred art. These arts, by their very nature, are oriented toward the infinite beauty of God, which they attempt in some way to portray by the work of human hands. They achieve their purpose of redounding to God's praise and glory in proportion as they are directed the more exclusively to the single aim of turning men's minds devoutly toward God. That's Sacrosanctum Concilium, number 122. In this interview, David Clayton, an internationally known artist, teacher, writer, and broadcaster, has picked some of the best books on Catholic sacred art. An Englishman, educated at Oxford, David Clayton is provost of www. Pontifex University, for whom he created the unique Master of Sacred Arts program. He holds the post of Artist in Residence of Scala Foundation in Princeton, New Jersey. He has major commissions from churches in the United States and the United Kingdom, including the Brompton Oratory in London, and has illustrated several children's books, including God's Covenant with You by Scott Hahn. His popular blog is thewayofbeauty.org, and in addition, he writes regularly for the New Liturgical Movement website. His books include The Way of Beauty, Liturgy, Education and Inspiration for Family, School and College, Painting the Nude, The Theology of the Body and Representation of Man in Christian Art, and The Little Oratory, a beginner's guide to praying in the home. David Clayton, welcome.
Thank you. Very good to be here.
Sacred art can be understood either broadly or narrowly. Construed broadly, it encompasses sacred buildings, sculptures, paintings, vessels, and vestments. Construed more narrowly, it consists of sacred sculptures and paintings. Which sense do you have in mind?
Well, I know more about paintings and sculpture, but I think that to include that broader definition is fair. But most of what I'm going to be talking about here is visual art, and actually the books that I'm recommending, predominantly painting, is what I'm thinking about. Yeah.
And in your view, what is the current state of Catholic sacred art?
Dire. One word.
With a few exceptions, I presume.
There are some people who are trying to buck the trend, shall we say, but the standard of what you get in most churches and the knowledge of what's even necessary is very low, I would say, compared to what would have just appeared automatically in churches in the past. And the availability of artists is very low as well. We've reached a really low ebb, I would say. Now this is an opportunity. It means we can, we've got a clean sheet to try and start again and try and create something that's wonderful and beautiful. So I'm not daunted by that. I mean, that's why I devote my time to what I do. And we have all the ingredients necessary. We have man with a mission. That was a beautiful passage, by the way, from the Constitution of Sacred Liturgy. I'd not heard that before, I'm ashamed to say. But we have man, we have God, and we have the materials to make art with. So there's no reason why we can't equal or even surpass, through God's grace, the glories of the past.
But you're of the view that the current state of Catholic sacred art is quite dismal. What would you put that down to? What are the causes?
I would say, and I take my cue here from Benedict XVI, who I respect as an authority on these matters. He's speaking as individual, not as the Pope when he talks about these things, or as not infallibly, but nevertheless, I respect him hugely. But what in his analysis, as described in the book The Spirit of the Liturgy, he says that there was effectively the creation of art and the art forms became separated from our worship. So the wellspring of Catholic culture, of Christian culture, I would say, therefore, is our worship. And when our worship is in harmony with visual imagery and also architecture and music and the other arts as well, then what you have is a very powerful and beautiful culture of faith, as he calls it. When that is the case, it can become the driving force for a wider culture, which then engages with people outside the church and forms them. It primes them, if you like, to be ready for what they see when they come back into the church. That was always the case. There was a seamless transition from the culture of faith into what Pope Benedict calls contemporary culture, the wider culture of the time, which could then be generally described as Christian. And he says that there was a break, and the problem is liturgical, and it occurred perhaps as early as the early 19th century. You could see a separation in the way that people worshipped and their engagement with art. They worshipped in a way that did not, in which they didn't engage with the art, so therefore it became superfluous and ultimately became neglected.
Now, there are many things that Catholics can do to appreciate and maybe even promote sacred art. For example, visiting museums and historic churches, or picking an original work of art for prayer at home. Some might even team up to improve the quality of the liturgical art used in the parish. What would you recommend? Do you have any favorite strategies?
Well, I've got a two-pronged strategy, and one is to offer a formation to the artists. So we need a training. Artists need to have skill. They need to have an understanding of Christian traditions in art and how art serves the liturgy. They need, therefore, to be producing beautiful sacred art in an enlightened way, so that it strikes people. And this can turn people's hearts, even people who are not generally appreciative of art or don't think of themselves as appreciating high culture. If it is authentically beautiful and linked to the worship, it can affect people, and people don't need to be educated in art to do it. But nevertheless, it always helps if you create the market for it. You can form people to appreciate what is authentically beautiful as well. And how do you do that? It can be a little, to a certain degree, you can have art classes which teach people the tradition. So in that sense, a similar sort of training for patrons of the arts as you would have for artists. Patrons work in partnership with artists and should be doing more than simply supplying the money, shall we say. They need to understand what is needed for the community for whom they're commissioning the piece. But at the same time, I think you need a bottom-up process in which you're forming people to make use of the art in the liturgical context. And so it is through teaching people to pray with art, to understand how in the context of the liturgy, they can actually pray with art. So, for example, every time a saint is mentioned, if there is a picture of that saint, turn and look and address the saint through the art. At the moment, very few do this. We might invoke the name of Mary, for example, in the context of the Mass somewhere, and no one looks at the statue of Mary. They will typically have their eyes shut. So you can teach people to do that. Now, how do you transmit that? Part of the reason that I wrote with Lila Lawler, who was a great person to work with, we wrote together the book called The Little Oratory. It was actually teaching people to pray with visual imagery in the home and giving them some sort of parameters to choose the art which serves prayer well. And the premise of this is that if we pray well, then the art that seems to support that prayer will be good sacred art on the whole. I mean, you look at the general appreciation, and so it's by encouraging people to pray liturgically in the home. The reason that I focused on the home is that I don't like badgering priests. I feel that priests they're in service of the church. At the parish context, many don't have the training that's necessary. But frankly, unless they're asking you for information, they've probably got enough on their plate. I'm grateful that they are there doing that. And just to add another criticism to what they're doing, which probably isn't the most helpful thing. If they're asking the questions and you have that sort of relationship in a parish, that's terrific. But it occurs to me that in the home, we can pray liturgically and authentically liturgically by praying the Liturgy of the Hours. And so in that context, if we learn to pray with the art, we're developing communities that will naturally desire what is good. And then my hope is that that will come into the parish and seep its way up, so to speak.
And what principles have you followed in drawing up your list of recommended books?
Well, what principles? I think I'll tell you a little story about how I even got involved in this, and this will help me to describe the principles. So I started off wanting to serve the church as an artist and wanting to know what to do, and I could not find the training anywhere. It was difficult enough to get the skills, but eventually just about possible. I could pick icon painting classes here. I went to learn a method of drawing and painting called the academic method in Florence. So I'm carefully choosing individual courses to build up my skills. And even then, you're making a sort of patchwork quilt of a training and doing that. Not really ideal, but possible if you're driven and committed. People can do that. I've seen people do that and develop the necessary skills. But then you need to understand how to direct those skills in the service of the church. What constitutes authentic liturgical art? And so the books that I have picked are those that I found most useful in trying to understand that describe to me the traditions of the church, the principles that would direct the artist's brush when they're painting. And of course, at the top of that is that the ultimate purpose of creating art, which you read, which was in the reading you gave us so beautifully. I will say, I asked you about this, as you know. I've included one of my own books in this, and I am by nature, I'll admit it, a self-publicist, but it isn't just for that reason. I found that there was really very little information available, and so I had to draw from a whole string of different sources what I felt was appropriate, what I felt I was looking for. And so I put into my book, The Way of Beauty, which is the one that I've recommended and that you mentioned earlier, those things which I don't think are in a Catholic sacred art textbook otherwise. However well or badly I've done it, I believe it fills out a vacuum which is not there otherwise, or information is not there otherwise.
So the first book in your list is one you've already mentioned, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger's The Spirit of the Liturgy.
Yeah.
This book is not about sacred art as such. It has sections in sacred art, however, it focuses on the liturgy, the setting of sacred art. Why have you chosen this book to top your list?
Well, as you say, it's not about art directly, it's about the liturgy. The chapter in art is immensely rich, like the book as a whole. It might be 150 pages or something. And he has a way of writing that you can unpack what he's saying. So it's a short chapter, and it's there. But I think that it's very good to understand that the liturgy, the worship of God, is the highest activity that we can engage in this life, and it's a participation in the heavenly activity of loving God in heaven. That's the closest we can do it. So, and it informs everything else we do. So, by through that, all that we can do can be part of the activity of loving God and can be sanctified by it. But ultimately, the source and summit of all Christian activity is the liturgy. And so we need to understand that before we can then understand how the art can be placed into that context. And I think that The Spirit of the Liturgy is the best book that I have found as a first read anyway, to do that. And frankly, as you know, if you read nothing else, it's so rich. It gives a deep understanding of what is the wellspring of Catholic culture. What I mean by that, and that includes what I mean by that is that the forms that you see in Christian culture are formed from the inspiration of the liturgy. Now, all cultures are of a time and of a place. We understand the general through the particular, but the liturgy is the source of its own culture. It isn't simply the external cultures that exist around it. That they will contribute to it as well. But when people talk, for example, about Western European culture being representing certain things and being inappropriate for other places, well, to the degree that they participate in what is universal in Christian culture, they are appropriate to all people. And so it's perfectly legitimate where there is no Christian culture to bring those forms in as they are, and then gradually to adapt them from that starting point to the place and time, as the Spanish did in South America, for example, or in Central America. But this is not Europe engaging in cultural imperialism. This is Christianity offering its own culture to others so that they can take it as a gift and then develop it as their own from that starting point.
And second on your list is God's Human Face, the Christian icon written by the Archbishop of Vienna, Cardinal Christoph Schonborn, back when he was an academic. The book is on the theological foundations of icons and explores the theological debates surrounding the iconoclast controversy in 8th century Byzantium. What are icons? Why are pictorial representations of Christ important? And why have they been deemed idolatrous?
Okay, so the reason I chose this book, and through that I'll answer your questions in a general way, is that it's important that as Catholics we understand, first of all, that the basic justification for the use of images. So when at the Seventh Ecumenical Council, which he talks about, so he's covering the period of history and the development of theology in the period prior to the Seventh Ecumenical Council in 787, and then a little bit after, because it took a while for the pronouncement of that council, which made it clear that the church mandates the use of sacred art. it took a while for that to take hold, and he describes why that was as well. So he goes to about 100 years later. But the argument over idolatry couldn't be sorted out until the Christology was sorted out, because the arguments for the use of images relate to why Christ is the image of the Father and we are made in the image and likeness of God. So all of this had to be established, and so a lot of the book is describing the councils prior to this and their development of the idea that Christ is a single person but has two natures, and what that means. And once you understand that, then it becomes legitimate to paint Christ as man, the person of Christ as man, because he was visible to people. And the idea of the fact that he's saying that we approach the Father through him. So in other words, we worship the Father through the Son in the Spirit. That's what we do in the liturgy. And the idea of an image does that by engaging with something that we can see, we're offering something to a person that we can't see. And so we through the Father, through the Son, we reach the Father, but then by analogy, through an image of Christ, we reach Christ himself in our imaginations. And so it allows for that transference of respect or honor or worship, which has to be appropriate to what it's given to, and that changes according to the person. But it allows for that transference through the image. So we're not worshipping the image, we're worshipping Christ, but we're doing it through the image as a guide, as a help to us. Now, the argument about idolatry really related to, and this has cropped up over centuries, the most common objection will be with regard to the commandment that says, "Thou shalt not create any graven image." And so people are interpreting that and wondering what it means. And my understanding is that it actually means that you shall not make an idol. In other words, an image for false worship. Because then in the Bible, the next thing that God does is instruct the Israelites to create images as part of their liturgical worship. Incidentally, one of the reasons that that Calvin condemned imagery was that he interpreted that commandment as referring to all images rather than idols. In other words, false images, images of false gods or gods that don't exist. And so because he was only reading it in translation, I think that's what I understand. But actually, that is not the original meaning of the commandment, and so all of this had to be sorted out. Idolatry can mean would be worshipping the image. We don't do that. Or it could mean worshipping a false god through an image of a false god, and we don't do that. That's very, very clear. But it's also clear from what the council said, that it isn't just the case that sacred art is permitted, it's mandated. We are bound to do this because they believe that if we don't do this, we lose the faith. And I'm sure there are many reasons. I'm not going to claim this is the only one, but we're in a situation now where sacred art is really not at the heart of the Catholic Church's worship anymore. Certainly not in the liturgical context. It might be in sort of devotional prayer, and hasn't been for some time. And we see in parallel the faith declining in numbers. And so I think if there's one thing that we could do to contribute to building up the faith, it's to have authentic liturgical reform and harmonizing that with the veneration of images. And that would be something, that's the part that I'm addressing, shall we say. I'm not going to say it's the only problem. There are all sorts of reasons, I'm sure.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview, or to support this podcast, visit the website 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast on the platform of your choice so that more people can discover it, and give it a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Until next time, God bless.